Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We have a very special guest today, Rikki Schlott, writer, author now. That's exciting. You've got a new book out.
Yes, October 17th, The Canceling of the American Lions with Greg Lukianoff.
Yeah.
So almost officially an author, which is kind of crazy to say.
Well, I think officially it's in print now. Like you've got physical
Yeah,
copies
it's
of the
physically
book.
behind me, so
Yeah.
I guess it counts. But yeah, I'm kind of just bracing for the impact of the book, so it's exciting.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. I mean, so you and I ran into each other on when Clubhouse was kind of a blip back in the day, but I followed your work since then, and it's gotten progressively more exposure, which is nice because you write from a point of view that I don't see very often, which is, the younger generation and people that are like, can we act like normal fucking human beings for a while? That whole situation. I don't know what you call that exactly, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I think just like there are a shockingly and depressingly few number of young voices that I would like to think that I tack towards common sense, and there don't seem to be that many writers that are also Gen Z that feel the same way. Although I would say that there's an enormous audience for it, which heartens me. But it's hard to actually like put yourself out there and like I was planning to go to law school and a totally different route, and this kind of turned me off that entire course. So I understand why most people who might think similarly might rather just kind of go along to get along and put their head down.
Sure. Yeah. It's certainly easier to do that. Excuse me, how did you get into this in the first place? Like you've got a pretty interesting background. I know your dad is, you got an old dad, which is nice. So insofar as getting away with things when you're a teenager, but I don't know how it plays, growing up. Exactly. My dad was younger, but, how did you get into, I guess from the trajectory you were on, which sounds like, undergrad then law school to, writing about culture, writing about, I think you write more about thinking than about culture, honestly, but yeah, how did that happen exactly?
Yeah, as you mentioned, my dad actually turned 86 this year, so he's very much an older dad considering I'm 23. But I would say that definitely like anchored me in a different time period in a weird way, just like a small little part. So I'd come home with like my Zoomer isms, and my dad would be like, "Shut up! I do not want to hear you use like use weird lingo." Or I remember being a kid growing up and like coming home and having the new like language police instructions ready to unleash on my dad when I was probably in like second grade. I'm like, Dad, we actually don't say African American anymore. We say Black. And I remember my dad at the dinner table looking at me like, we just switched this like 2 days ago. And it was a very like formative kind of moment in my life of understanding that like the cultural context was shifting so quickly, and that intent matters as much as impact. And so I think that having that kind of anchor with an older parent who was able to kind of hold me steady was very fortunate, and also in combination with a mom from an Eastern European background with a lot of sensibility who would not tolerate a lot of the kind of crazy stuff that happened in my world at NYU and in high school, and a lot of the wokeness. So I had a good context growing up in my estimation. And I went to NYU undergrad, like 4.0 GPA, super academic, head down, had my Thomas Sowell books, my Jordan Peterson books quite literally hidden under my bed in freshman year because I was afraid someone might, God forbid, walk in and know that I think differently. And I was going along to get along, and then the pandemic happened, and NYU tried to pull $6,000 per class for Zoom school, which is the no tuition break, nothing to help the fact that we were all just completely online and hunkered down. And so my family, I give my mom like complete credit for coming to me. I was miserable doing that, and it was just not paying off. It was not the experience that I wanted out of my college. And she came to me and she said, I will help you make it through, like financially make it through one semester leave of absence if you promise me that will do something actually interesting and cool. And so I just like read and read and read, and finally had time to actually read what I wanted to read. And I had like a kind of epiphany moment with like a lot of the classical liberal values and fundamental like founding underpinning principles that make America what it is, and a lot of stuff that I should have learned in school, frankly, beforehand. That it just really hit me like a ton of bricks, where I became very animated, especially seeing like during COVID a lot of liberties deprived in my own life for the first time, and I just it really made me want to speak out and say kind of screw it. And so I started with some op-eds in the New York Post, and sure enough, it kind of just tumbled to the point where I had done like 3 leaves of absence from NYU, and finally just dropped out because I'd much rather do what I love and find my voice than feel like I need to go back to square one. And definitely in the proud dropout gang at this point in
Sure,
time.
yeah.
So that's the abbreviated version.
Yeah, congratulations, by the way, on not wasting any more of your time. We do have this
Thank you.
proclivity as human beings to what's it, the spend cost fallacy, just to keep walking in the same direction because we're already going that way. That's fucking dumb.
Hmm.
So it's good that you were able to get out of that. Yeah, and I think I want to a couple of things you said. One about the shifts in language that happen are very interesting to me. There's a lot of good literature on this, or you could just listen to George Carlin's stand up from back in the day. But
Hmm.
the fact that it shifts so quickly, what it is, what's okay to say and what's not okay to say, especially these days, to me, is evidence that the point isn't to be polite or inclusive or to take people's feelings into consideration, but it's to create a victim class and a victimizer class, right? And then give yourself the ability to decide who's in which group by just identifying who you want the victimizer class to be, take their common language and make that bad somehow just by saying it's bad because there's no rhyme or reason to any of this. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
this is something that you talk about, just the way that people's minds are manipulated in the book, and we'll get into that in a moment. And but I think it's like there's a lot of surreal shit going on right now. Like the author of Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky, now sits around and proudly cheers consent being manufactured. You know what I mean? It's
Hmm.
such a weird time in human history where everybody kind of knows that these people, these institutions are full of shit, and they're still like, well, what are you gonna do? You know what I mean? Because in days past, this would not have gone this way. People would be rioting in the fucking streets.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think I do feel like I'm more and more heartened though with more young people kind of waking up or just doing their own thing and leaving these institutions. Like as much as I think it's tragic that there was a recent Gallup poll that showed that Gen Z's faith in institutions is like through the floor at this point in time. And like I think that's obviously I'd rather a world where institutions are deserving of trust, but I think that there's more doubt. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure for some people that makes them a Marxist, and they're not all necessarily going down the route of like trying to revive classical liberalism.
Mm.
But I would say that there is like an increasing wake up of young people, especially in terms of like not just going down that prescribed route of success. I mean, the dropout rates people tout as like some tragedy, which I'm sure in some examples and plenty of instances is people just like losing motivation or succumbing to addiction or something. But I know a lot of young people who are just saying like, I'm going to pave my own path now, and I don't need to go through all of these rungs, which gives me a little bit more faith that there could be kind of like a market pressure correction on some of these institutions.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it does look like some of that is starting to happen. My buddy Gerard Michaels was talking about this the other day. You know, like he feels bad for his Democrat friends, especially the young ones, because they had some pretty legitimate concerns about things like affordable health care, for example, or
Hmm.
making sure that we're not becoming oppressive through majority and things like this. Stuff that our system of government is kind of set up to not become, or affordable schooling or housing or something like that. And then these, I don't know what you would call them, oligarchs, globalists, Marxists, whatever the fuck's going on these days. I mean, it's kind of, all of these phrases tend to become catch-alls, for
Hmm.
anything that you don't like. So it's hard to define them specifically, but they came with the solutions that powerful people normally do, which is self-serving solutions that don't actually address any of the root concerns of anybody. And then they believe, because they've been elected, like, well, 70% of Gen Z voted for Democrats, so they must like what we're doing, like sending money to Ukraine, or defunding police, or cutting kids' dicks off, and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? But that's like,
Hmm.
it's a very bizarre relationship that and I blame boomers and my generation for it, because we fell asleep at the wheel on this shit, and now you guys are going to have to fight. You know what I mean? To get some of this, it's not even just about civil liberties. You're going to have to fight just to get a sense of normalcy back, so we can talk about civil liberties
Yeah.
again. You know what I mean? It's pretty fucked up.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, I mean, if you look at the approval ratings of Biden generationally and Democrats in general recently, Gen Z had the highest approval rating of Biden when he took office, like
Mm,
above even where young people were when Obama was president. And it had the most precipitous drop among young people. It's something like a 4%, like very high approval rating versus 16% in the general population. So I think that there are more and more young people who, may have voted blue in uh like landslide essentially, but are not necessarily happy with that
mm,
choice or with the choices before them at least. So it makes me feel better that we're not just like blue no matter who, like
mm.
down the line.
Yeah, and well, Republicans don't do themselves any favors by the kind of candidates they put in front of people
No.
either, frankly. But it's let's not spend the whole time talking about politics. We're going to get lost here. Um, I want to talk about the book. The book is The Canceling of the American Mind, and there's a lot of good stuff in here. I read it over the weekend. I mean, it is. You can jump through any section of it and read it independently, and it still tracks really well. It's a very well written book, which I should expect from you and the
Thank you.
team that wrote it. Obviously, this is from one of the co-authors of Coddling of the American Mind, and the other one wrote the foreword for it, I believe.
Yeah.
I believe most of our listeners have read that book, and if they haven't, they should. Tell me about the book, and some general themes, and we'll get into some more specifics.
Yeah, so the genesis of the book was actually that I had read Coddling when I was, I think, a freshman in college, which would have been around when it came out, and it totally jived with all my experiences in my generation, and felt like it could put it like Greg and John, the co-authors, really put their finger on things that I like noticed these symptoms of, but could not really understand the root cause of, which boiled down is essentially cognitive distortions that were creating an anxious and depressed generation on campus. And so in the pandemic, when I was first writing for the New York Post and still just contributing op-eds, I was very optimistic, and I thought that perhaps the pandemic could uncoddle young people. And I interviewed Greg for that article, which is how we first met. And we realized that there was a ton that we had in common in terms of our concern for our country and for the state of free speech, and also the fact that I just had eyes on the ground in a way that he and
Mm,
John weren't able to with the age difference. And so originally this book was going to be directly a follow-up to Coddling. But then it shifted in its focus. I think a lot of the same themes still ring throughout the book. And certainly having John write the foreword sets the tone that this is in part a follow up, but we wanted to delve into cancel culture specifically. Firstly, because there's still people who claim that it's not really a thing, or that it's just a moral panic, or that it's something that is in the past. But I would say it's something that very much concerns me going forward. I would have probably been in the camp in like 2019 of thinking like, oh, the 2016 election was really weird, and that was just a strange time, and we had unprecedented candidates, and we pulled people down and burned the house down a little bit, but like we're fine now. And then 2020 happened, and it was even worse than it was in 2016. And I'm quite concerned that this book will become even more sadly relevant in 2024 with this next election cycle. And I mean, I've just watched pretty much for my entire adult life, or even young adult life, cancel culture really reigning over particularly young people, and causing mass self-censorship, and really undermining the values of our country, and of free speech and of pluralism, and preventing us from having a robust democracy that actually can talk through our issues and our problems. And so I've described this book essentially as like when you try to give a dog a pill and you put peanut butter on the pill to like entice them to eat it. And so the peanut butter of this book is the cancel culture, but the pill is really the free speech culture, which we think is the restorative solution to this. And so it's not just a doom and gloom book. I think
Mhm.
it's definitely a call for a restoration of some fundamental American values to help us fight back against this kind of mounting of liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, do you think it's possible to get the right and left to communicate again? I don't know that right and left is even a thing anymore. To be honest,
Yeah.
I don't think I buy that premise anymore. And maybe it is, but it can't be functionally exercised because everything is so fucked up as far as the discourse goes, right? Now, you
Yeah.
guys in the book, you talk about because we're in a game of tit for tat right now. Institutions are captured by powers that have no concern for us whatsoever. They don't give a shit about what's going on here. But people are still playing that game. It's like if you found out that the NFL was scripted or something, you know what I mean? Like if it was just like wrestling and you found out it was scripted, are you
Hmm.
still really going to be a fan of your team? I think people would. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There would be some level because of their association with it and it's become part of their identity. They would apply some pretty broad ranging cognitive dissonance there and be like, you know what, maybe part of it is rigged, but it's still entertaining. People always make these excuses.
Hmm.
I wonder from your perspective, especially after writing this book, and seeing like really getting down into the weeds on how fucked everything kind of is. Is it what are we doing? How's it going to be possible to reestablish like a cohesive epistemology? You know what I mean? But a set of facts that
Yeah.
people agree on because we don't have that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the one of the kind of case studies that we go through throughout the book, we have these interspersed like cancel culture and publishing or journalism. And essentially one of the themes of the book is that this sense and this like very obvious reality to most people that dissenters in knowledge producing institutions will be pulled down, like whether it's someone like Barry Weiss and with a heterodox view at the New York Times or someone like Jay Bhattacharya with a heterodox view on COVID. This like even if someone isn't getting canceled in these institutions, I think that the broader public has woken up to the fact that even if somebody finds something, uncomfortable in their research, or even if they might believe something that might be a little bit out there or might put their kind of neck out there if they were to say it publicly, that there's mass self-censorship and that most people are fully aware of that fact and rightfully distrust institutions to actually produce accurate an accurate view of the knowledge that they may have. And so I think the COVID-19 kind of example that we go through in the book and how, someone like Jennifer Say, who just said something as simple as like, maybe we shouldn't be shutting down schools and allowing the poorest kids among them to suffer the most as a consequence, like her just getting completely deplatformed and squeezed out of Levi's and like time after time, I think to your point, we've completely lost faith in these institutions to actually produce truth because that's how dissent is treated. And I would say it's worst of all in higher education. We have some really disturbing cases there. So it's definitely we refer to it as an epistemic crisis and definitely a moment in time where like just the shared body of facts are completely devastated and Greg and I share, I mean, Greg's the president and CEO of FIRE, which is the Foundation
Mm.
for Individual Rights and Expression, which is kind of stepping into an area that I think the ACLU has abdicated, where they used to just be defending free speech on campus, but now are doing so just across the board in any context. And Greg and I definitely believe that it's a restoration of some of the old idioms of like to each his own or everyone's entitled to their own opinion and just like a reinvigoration of some of these free speech principles that I think we've gotten so complacent about. And I know it sounds very kind of optimistic and naive to say as much, but I genuinely believe that there's like an enormous thirst for some sort of restorative vision among young people. Like I was 15 when the 2016 election was ramping up. I've never known a period of time where Americans could like treat their neighbors kindly or where Thanksgiving tables weren't being like pulled apart by partisanship, by politics, by the fact that we were living in our own echo chambers. And so I mean, I look at the statistics time and again. If you ask Gen Z, if you ask all generations what their view is of cancel culture, the younger you are, the more positive your view is. Millennials are like totally gung ho, ready to pull any dissenter down, except for that trend completely reverses with Gen Z, where they have by far the most negative view of cancel culture. And I think that there's a desire to return to a period of time that we don't even really remember because we know so acutely how like shitty it is, for lack
Mm.
of a better word, to grow up and to know that the stupid thing you did as a teenager is now like there forever. I mean, we go through an example of this girl who was 15 and she got her permit and she in a 3-second Snapchat video, like sent it to one of her friends, and she said, "I can drive N words." A white girl who said that, who forgot about it, and then by the time she was 18, a classmate had held on to that video and she had just gotten into her college of choice and the classmate sent it to the college and she lost her scholarship, she lost her admissions. I mean, obviously that's not the most flattering 3-second video, but I think that everyone has a moment when they're 15 or 16 where they do something inartful, and that should be something that dies with the memory of whoever was around you. And so Gen Z is acutely aware of the fact that we're walking on eggshells. We always have been, and I think hungry for a solution. And the only solution is these values that we've become so complacent about. And I mean, I felt it myself. It took sitting down and reading John Stuart Mill on my own in a pandemic to actually even realize these values existed and why it's so important for me to champion them now. But I think if we can actually open young people's minds to just how profound this inheritance of a free speech culture that we do have, but we've lost sight of, really is, then I think that that's truly the only way forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and another thing I'm concerned about, I don't know what if this is a good phrase for it, but like reverse cancel culture, maybe it's like the easy thing to do if you were on the side of the aggrieved, I guess, in this regard,
Hmm.
is to overcorrect in the opposite direction. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? I see a lot of people who
Yep.
both believe and then promote ideas that are clearly fucking stupid just because they're being like, just because somebody's getting canceled or because they're getting censored doesn't mean what they're saying is true. You know what I mean? Like that's
Hmm.
not an iron law, and
Absolutely.
it's the inverse, I suppose, of bad men have bad ideas, right? That's not true either.
Hmm.
Those are
Yep.
logical fallacies, right?
Yep.
And it's especially easy to do that while and stand like intractably hard in that position, which is also not a reasonable thing to do when the other side is
Hmm.
promoting fragility. You know what I mean? Because that's the
Hmm.
yin to that particular yang. But we need to be talking about ideas and not people, right? And this is always the solution to these things. We get in human beings always do this. We get into these periods of hero worship, or it's a collective idea versus a populist idea, and but reducing things down to just principles is typically how we
Hmm.
work our way out of these situations. It's what the founding fathers did. It's what the French Democratic Revolution did. It's a million examples throughout human history, and it kind of leads me into the next topic I want to talk about. And it's these two, since we're talking about epistemology and conversations, it's these two, I guess you would call them debate styles that the right and the left have used recently. One, and
Yep.
you and Greg talk about this in the book. One is the left's version, which is the perfect rhetorical fortress, and then the right's version is the efficient rhetorical fortress. Can you break those down a little bit for the audience? Because I don't know if people have heard these phrases before.
Yeah, these are phrases of Greg's invention, that I've been fortunate to be able to breathe a little life into. But the perfect rhetorical fortress basically is this kind of like argue. You can think of it as like being inside a castle with a bunch of walls around you, and if someone tries to like walk into your mental capacity and has an idea to present to you, it's all the ways that you can just completely tune them out and dismiss them, which the perfect one is perfect because the left is quite inventive with the way that they insulate themselves from ideas. The the right less so with the efficient rhetorical fortress. But the perfect rhetorical fortress is something that was kind of refined in academia, and you can kind of see it trickling throughout. Even when Greg was in law school like decades ago, some of these things were totally in play. But essentially, you can use the characteristics of anyone who's speaking to tune them out or to decide to listen to them. And so it's as simple. I mean, you can tune out half of the American population if you're someone on the left
Mm.
who just thinks that anybody who is a conservative or who you can accuse of being a conservative, which sometimes like you, I mean, I'll hear the most ridiculous like Barack Obama is a conservative because he's not the right kind of Democrat or something. And it's basically you can if someone's on the right, then anything that they have to say is wrong, and so you don't have to listen to them. And then if someone is a male, then you can say like, oh, that's just a male opinion, or God forbid a white male. And so it's like layer after layer after layer of things that you wouldn't believe when I was on campus at NYU of like being someone saying like, oh, that's just because you're a cis het person that you think that. And it was got to the like point where I'd be in these philosophy classes and I would genuinely estimate about a third of the time when a student would talk in like a seminar style class, they would preface their point as like as a X, Y, and Z and whatever kind of identity points they could put forth first to assert their authority before they even say anything, because that was like the social currency, weirdly. And I remember at one point in time I had said like, oh, as a woman I think this. I'm like, wait, why am I thinking this as a woman? And why, like, that's pretty much the only card that I have to play in this sort of game. But effectively, I mean, you see it on Twitter all the time of like, oh, that's because you're a white male, or
Sure,
because
yeah.
this or that, or whatever identity characteristic you can place on somebody, where you don't actually ever engage with the point that they're making. You
Mm.
just shut them down. Or even it gets to the point where, like, for example, we talked to Coleman Hughes about this, and he told us like, yeah, I'm my if I say the right thing, my race is my credit. If I say the wrong thing, then I'm not really black. And you hear that sort of thing all the time. Or like I've even been accused, like God forbid, I went on Ben Shapiro's show to talk about a woman's issue, so I'm not really a woman. I'm just a pawn for the
Mm.
conservative movement. And so that's the left side where it's very identity focused. On the right, there tends to be a different kind of fallacy where just because somebody is in an expert class, which I mean, I'm totally sympathetic to this because when and during COVID, I definitely lost faith in expertise. And
Mm.
this isn't something that we think is totally without some warrant that people feel this way. But just because you have the credential next to your name, then you must be connected to whomever or speaking for an institution. Or just because you're a journalist, then we don't have to listen to you. And then for some people, certainly in the more MAGA wing, like if you're critical of Trump, or if you've ever been critical of Trump, then therefore you're just like a hater and we can tune you out. And so that's definitely, we acknowledge that it's a much less elaborate and much less kind of um, institutionally backed viewpoint, but it's certainly a powerful one that I think on both sides I've watched often. Just this idea that like, oh, we just shut this person off because we don't like something about them. And there's the degradation of discourse has been just unimaginable. I mean, watching this take place has been really disheartening, and I think that it's only getting worse and worse and worse. And I've yet to see any like social media platforms or any public forums really be a healthy meeting ground for ideas and debates. And I think this ad hominem sort of attack of people is just totally derailing our actual like pursuit of truth as a society.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it seems like the right kind of circles the wagons, I guess, or but around people. You know what I mean? It's like I'm going to find a figurehead of some sort that
Hmm.
aligns with my worldview and then protect them at all costs. But
Hmm.
frankly, I find it hard to believe that a lot of people believe Trump aligns with their worldview. If you're truly conservative or a libertarian, you know what I mean. Like he doesn't do a whole lot of what we
Yeah.
would consider to be classical conservative things, and
Yeah.
uh,
Certainly.
uh, that's pretty bizarre. But it's also very ironic that the political left is almost exclusively at this point rating ideas based on the immutable characteristics of their author. That might be
Yeah.
the dumbest thing that's currently happening right now. just that particular style of deflection, because it's not only dumb, generally speaking, but it's counter to their entire worldview, allegedly, right? I don't know
Yeah.
if that's still the case or not. I'm not sure. I haven't checked in with a whole lot of liberals lately on, like on prejudice and things like that. But it seems to me that most of the prejudice comes from the political left these days. And that's very bizarre. Like, in the
Hmm.
same way, if you think about the economic situation in America right now, when conservatives stopped trying to curtail government spending, everything became fucked, right? Because that's your job. Like, you're the guy, you're the CPA. You're supposed to be the one making sure we're not spending too much money. And they're like, fuck it, let's
Yeah.
start a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, so we're going to spend $8 trillion. And now here we are, right? Like, I think that this is the crux, I think, of this argument and of coddling and of your book and most of the work you do, frankly, is that we need the right and the left, right, to balance one another. These
Mhm.
characteristics that they've had historically are what keep us in the middle somewhere, not political middle. I mean, like, somewhere where we're not tipping one too far one way or another, where we're not being dicks to everybody, but we're also not,
Hmm.
putting ourselves in a bad situation. You got to find a middle ground there. And we're not doing much of that now. As a matter of fact, this has become one of the most politically toxic periods in all of American history, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
I think there's two examples that you mentioned in the book. One is the Red Scare, the communist, the McCarthyism bullshit, from the middle part of the 20th century. And then, of course, there's the Aliens and Seditions Act by John Adams back in the day, which is we
Hmm.
have we're very romantic about our founding fathers, but Alexander Hamilton trying to foment insurrection before we even got started as a country, and John Adams deporting people and arresting them for talking shit about him in the newspaper and stuff. It's like we've had these
Hmm.
problems for a long time, and we've been better at solving them than we are now, right? But you think your guys' premise is that this is gonna, in 50 years or whatever, however long, this is gonna shine out in the same way that these previous periods of, political tumult have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, the number of just based on fires data, they've until I guess like almost a year ago were entirely higher education focused, and they've have examples since I think like 2014. It's been 1,000 professors that have been targeted for otherwise protected speech or speech that should be protected, to be canceled or deplatformed or fired. And that number blows the Red Scare numbers out of the water. And the Red Scare is something that we rightfully still look back towards and think about. And in fact, at that point in time, and this is in no way to excuse what happened, but there was a very real and acute national security concern that underpinned that scourge of a liberalism, whereas today we don't really have a counterpart to that. And I think that social media is certainly an engine that's fueling this. But we strongly believe that historians in the future will be looking back at this moment of cancel culture, this moment of censoriousness, and trying to analyze what exactly happened here, because the scale is beyond what I think most people even really realize. I think we very quickly can kind of put like 2016 or what happened in 2020 in the back of our minds and just willfully forget it. But the numbers are staggering, and worse yet, we see consistently with polling of students and of professors and of everyday Americans that these examples, it's not just like, back in the day, maybe if you'd make a local newspaper if someone got fired. The way that these people who get canceled are so publicly petitioned against, or so publicly just burned at the stake, basically on social media. The degree of self-censorship that results from that, I think, is difficult to even quantify, because everyone looks at these examples and says, well, I'm not going to tread that same path. And so this is one of the most kind of profound exercises of ideological
Mm.
authoritarianism, because like you burn the path with the person too. And I saw that constantly, having been at NYU, and like even just writing in retrospect, such a benign little article compared to stuff that I write now about like, oh, free speech is bad at NYU when I was a junior there. And I thought that was just going to ruin my life. And, I definitely have lost friends there, since since writing that op-ed, but the amount of people, this is still one of the most disturbing things of my kind of origin story to me. When I wrote that article and I thought that I was just like on an island alone, thinking that free speech mattered or that there we needed a rise of a sensible middle on campus. I had people who I they were classmates that had sat next to me for an entire year, someone who lived right across the hall from me in my tiny little dorm, professors that I'd had classes with, deans of departments who all came to me or DM'd me or emailed me or found my email in the NYU list and said to me, like, oh, I completely agree with you and good for you for standing up, but just don't mention that this happened or just don't tell anyone that we've had this conversation. And when I realized, even at a place as like progressive and truly sometimes insane as NYU, that there were so many people that actually shared my concerns, but we would never have put it together if not for somebody putting themselves out there first. It made me realize that there's a lot of there's hunger for change everywhere and courage is contagious, but it's just a matter of like actually activating that because the self-censorship is just so pervasive and frightening, and I don't know that there's a historical parallel even to what's happening right now in at least recent American history.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to nail down. I mean, people talk about whether tongue in cheek or they're serious about like an American Civil War, and it's like between who and whom and over what exactly, because it's not like that anymore. You know what I mean? For
Yeah.
example, like there's our higher education has been completely infiltrated by Marxist nonsense, and it finds its way into corporate culture quite a bit as well. But in Canada, they're like it's there's also the war hawk part of it that's kind of bundled into this globalist bullshit where it's okay to be a Waffen SS officer provided you are Ukrainian and now we're supporting a war in Ukraine, right? And then the Canadian Parliament has given this motherfucker a standing
Yeah.
ovation. It's like, no, I mean,
Yeah.
the Waffen SS was very specifically responsible for the Holocaust. You know what I mean? Like running
Yeah.
camps and things like that. That was not all they did, but that was one of the things they certainly did. It's like, all right, we've lost our ability to think critically now. And I don't give a fuck about Ukraine. I couldn't care less if that place exists tomorrow, frankly. But if somebody supports intervention there or whatever, that's fine. But if your political position on that becomes such a part of your identity that you'll support literal Nazis, that that's a step that you've taken completely out of bounds now. Like you're not thinking like a human being anymore. You're thinking like a crazy person. This is
Yeah.
it's like mole person behavior. You know what I mean? I don't understand. I don't understand if there's some overarching purpose behind some of these things, or if it's just in general incompetence, or this is just the equation that equals people being fucking stupid. Who knows, right? I don't know. I do see these big organizations having secret meetings and talking about making people eat bugs and shit, and it's a little suspicious, right? It makes you think there might be something going on, but it does seem like there's some kind of concerted effort to erase trust in institutions. I think. Because if that's what I was trying to do and make people not believe in anything anymore, this is how I would do it, certainly. So you talk about like, yeah, this is a moment where COVID, especially the restrictions and the attempts to force vaccinate and stuff, and then the lies that the government told and the censorship have opened up this window for maybe some kind of social reformation of some sort. It is an opportunity, but it's also an opportunity for the most evil and bad actors around, right? And that's how it works. It's an iron law that people who desire power very rarely deserve it, and the people that deserve power very rarely desire it. But it's one of the things that impresses me about the work you guys do the most, because it isn't ubiquitously popular because you're calling a lot of people out, right? And not just famous people, but how individual people in their homes think. And it's uncomfortable to hear that you're fucked up. It's uncomfortable to hear that you've been thinking like an idiot and now that you need to improve. But somebody's got to fucking, if ordinary people who think critically and just normal people don't step into the breach into some of these leadership positions, we are going to be truly and hopelessly fucked, like in short order as well. So, what
Mhm.
kind of I don't know, I don't remember specifics about this in the book, but do you guys go into that in the book, like how ordinary people can? I know you talked about corporate culture and how managers can avoid shit and stuff like that, but and then parents how to try to avoid that stuff as well. But do you talk about just the general public and how this I guess power vacuum in the epistemology right now and how we're gonna repair that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely are reformed. The last section of the book is reform oriented, and as you mentioned, we have solutions for parenting and K to 12 education and higher education and corporations as well. And how, I mean, honestly, I think Greg and my agreement at this point in time is that it's a matter of just fostering the right values and viewpoints from early on and consistently, and hoping that a generation can step up and actually fix things. But I also think like just on the widespread day-to-day person level, we all can play a role in this beyond just like inculcating these kind of idioms to your children and raising them with these values, but also just being aware of the fact that like I mean, Greg and I same thing. Greg talks we Greg discusses in the book when he was in law school at Stanford, like shutting down anyone that was conservative in his mind was just bad. And I certainly was on, having been a more conservative person at NYU, very often just like, oh, if my professor says it, he's woke or
Mm.
he's a neo-lib and I don't have to listen to him. And so it's not that Greg and I are like perfect people who have a great score of listening to other viewpoints, but I think it's just this like awareness of the fact that we all have our own version of whatever fortress it is that we construct for ourselves, and all these weapons that we use to protect our viewpoints. And especially with social media, it's so easy to become entrenched into them and to find little like micro universes of people who feel the same way that you do, and then to want to protect that viewpoint and that narrative that you tell yourself about the world at all costs. And I think we're all guilty of it. But the thing that I mean, I think is just the most restorative move that we can make as a society, as a culture, or even as individuals, because the genuine like truth in my view is that leadership is so disaggregated where it no longer really matters quite as much what someone who's in some role of power or who's in Congress is doing, as much as like who did Joe Rogan have on his
Mm.
podcast this week. Like there is a disaggregation of power and control. I mean, I would say up in while he was at Fox, Tucker Carlson probably wielded more power over Republicans than Republicans did over themselves, just based on like who's gonna throw shade their way or who's gonna criticize them, and these little micro universes. And I think we all can play a role of setting an example and trying our best to keep at front of mind that we all very seriously and very often could be wrong with any given take that we have. And anyone who comes to us, even if they're the most stereotypical, like purple hair, gender bending, whatever it is, that whatever stereotype we might hold in our head of the other side, that they very well may have something worth listening to, and that every other person comes to the table with some sort of life experience or insight that we don't have. And I think we've lost the humility of being able to acknowledge our own blind spots, and I'm certainly just as guilty of that often. But I think it's just a matter of demanding that of ourselves and demanding that of the thought leaders or the public intellectuals that we support, and leaning into curiosity and leaning into the fact that like none of us have this perfect formation of the world. And unfortunately, we live in a moment where it's it's so comforting to be able to cling to that narrative because things are so crazy. And yet I think we all need to kind of just like take a leap and relinquish that and actually engage in meaningful conversation.
Sure, yeah. I think, and the way you talk about things matters too. I guess it's satisfying to dunk on people, and
Mhm.
we've kind of set a bad precedent for that. I mean, that has become a a very valuable social currency to have
Yeah.
dunked on. Like people in their Twitter bio will be like blocked by the real Donald Trump. Like, congratulations, dude,
Hmm.
you got blocked by somebody because you
Yeah.
were being annoying as shit. And
Yeah.
or we used to like take pride in and shape our identity around accomplishing great things. You know what I mean? That was something that you could do, or heroic things, or it's generally speaking noble acts of some sort. And now there are a great deal of people who, shape their identity around their argumentative nature and how they've burned somebody on the internet or something like that. I mean, it's fucking
Hmm.
dumb, to be honest, but I understand how it
Yeah.
happened, right? I mean, it's classical conditioning. If you keep giving somebody a treat every time they perform a behavior, they're going to keep performing that behavior. That's just the way it is. And I think the way
Absolutely.
we talk about stuff really matters. The idioms that we use collectively as a culture, whether it's the West or the United States or wherever, it's certainly an insight into what people believe and then how they think about each other and just how they think generally. How they, when I say how they think, I mean how they process information. You know what I mean? And I think that you guys talked about this in the book, like it's a free country to each their own. All of these very classically liberal phrases that we've all used for a very long time that now seem to have no real meaning, at least in the American political discourse. But I wonder if there isn't. I do believe that the way we speak about things matters. And if you're on this side, regardless of what your political affiliation is, if you're on this side of, hey, can we just have normal conversations again? Well, you better start fucking having normal conversations then, right? I mean, you better start using the right kind of language to talk to each other. Use the principle of charity, and instead of
Hmm.
like, oh, so what you're saying is, and then the worst possible interpretation of what that motherfucker just said. Actually, start
Yeah.
talking to people and be like, hey, I want to understand what your idea is. I'm not promising I'm going to agree with it, but I would at least like to understand what you're saying. That seems like it could be a very proactive, restorative behavior, and that's one thing that I try to encourage in people, because it is, look, especially with calling like Catholics, and I'm not particularly religious, but calling Catholic people terrorists or domestic violent extremists, or calling moms at school board meetings extremists. Like, come on, man. Like, I understand why people get angry and want to fight back against that shit, but you're not going to win over people who are still captured by this stuff by dunking on them, because human beings are going to
Hmm.
defend themselves. That's how it works. You know what I mean? It just doesn't. There's no efficacy at all to trying to shame somebody into submission. It doesn't work, right? Well, it works if you're an
Yeah.
institution, but it doesn't work if you're trying to make them think critically again. You have to give them the tools to think critically. One, then you have to give them the space to do it in, and then if it's needed, you have to give them a graceful exit or retreat from the situation they put themselves in. And we're in a big fucking. It's a big fucking problem right now that people who have been wrong about a lot of stuff, authoritarian wise, over the past couple of years, are continuously excluded from things. Conversations are continuously dunked on now by people who were right about it. It's like, cool, you were right. What's the next thing? You know what I mean? Like, if you're a
Hmm.
performer or athlete or something like that, and you played well yesterday, well, okay, that was yesterday. You know what I mean? Today's today. We still have to fucking fight and win as a team here. So can we get this back
Yeah.
together somehow? And you said that the Gen Z guys are a little more, I guess, suspicious of cancel culture. I don't know what it is. Like, can you
Hmm.
explain why you think they're coming out of it and becoming anti-cancel culture? Because I think there might be some lessons there that we can apply to these other people, and do so in, kind of a graceful way that doesn't embarrass or shame them.
Yeah. I think, to be clear, I think there's a mass distaste for cancel culture among Gen Z. I mean, it's something like 80% have a negative view. It's by far the most negative of any generation, and I strongly believe, from the context of having seen it play out for essentially our entire lives, and like even just, yeah, I mean, just being a teenager and walking over eggshells, or seeing someone like Alexi McCammond, I think is her name. She was a Teen Vogue. She was tapped to be Teen Vogue's editor in chief, and then some tweet that she sent out when she was like literally 17, 10 years before was circulating. I mean, I think that we're reaching a point where when you have a generation of people who are going to be assuming leadership positions
Mm.
or getting new jobs who all had iPhones when they were 10, like we're going to have a ceasefire on this front because we've all done and said stupid things, and we can empathize with people who are getting canceled in a way that I think prior generations might not have been able to, because we really just only know how graceless society is right now. The problem, I would say, there's two problems with Gen Z. One is the fact that we also are most often the people who are like running these campaigns. There's a serious tyranny of the minority in my generation. I strongly believe that. Like, I mean, the way that people came out of the woodwork at NYU proved that to me, but there's a real fear of fighting back against the squeakiest wheels who are very authoritarian, who are very much online, who are very much looking to like tear down I mean, we talked to a bunch of corporate leaders who are like, these Gen Z employees who are coming in are like trying to get me fired on Twitter the next day for some like microaggression. So there's a serious tyranny of the minority issue, and then also just a directionlessness, which like we all know that there's something wrong, and I shared in that sense when I was still at NYU and still hadn't really like had my aha moment with classical liberal values. I knew that there was something wrong. I wasn't sure what to put in its place, and I wasn't sure what the restorative vision was. And I think there's a mass abdication of our educational system in actually inculcating like civics values,
Mm.
and even just like something as that seems as silly as debate club is something that's no longer a thing. It actually requires you to engage with ideas critically, or learning about what the First Amendment is and why it matters beyond just the fact that you memorized like freedom of press or something like
Sure,
that,
yeah.
which didn't just, bounces right off your head when you're a teenager. I think the problem is there's a hunger for change. There's a knowledge of the fact that things are not healthy, and the way that we argue is not healthy, and the state of our institutions is not healthy, and our civil discourse is not healthy. But there's such a dearth of restorative solutions, and when you're somewhere like a college campus where people are saying that like words can wound you, and that the biggest fight is needing hate speech laws right now, or just mindlessly parroting certain progressive idioms, like it just feels like there's no one who's actually coming forth and saying like, yes, you guys are right, and you might disagree that there's something wrong with the way that we're arguing, and you might disagree on certain political tit for tat, but like in the end we all agree that we need something restorative and positive, and that's what we're trying to do with this book, is to say, okay, what do we put in the place of this void, which we say is a free speech culture.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting point about having grown up exposed to the danger of cancel culture, because it is probably the first generation that really grew up that way, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how I don't know what it is about human beings, but we'll learn a new fact and then call somebody an idiot for not knowing it, even though we just learned it like 5 minutes ago. That's a very I
Yeah.
think human beings bend towards authoritarianism a lot. You know what I mean? And look, you can see it throughout all of human history. But from the aristocratic class and the despotic side, but even at the lower level, people will. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's like just team politics or some shit. I really don't know. But people are so quick to be like, ah, fuck that guy. He thinks this and this and this. So
Mm.
he must be an idiot or whatever. It's like, no, smart people can have really bad ideas. Like Neil deGrasse
Yeah.
Tyson is a brilliant man. I know him. I've had him on the show, talked to him a lot, and he says some really dumb shit about gender. It's like this, like it's like, come on, man. Like, you're a physicist, you know better than this. What we're talking about ones and zeros here, bud. But brilliant minds can be captured, and just as anyone else can. So these kids that are going through that are going to become, like, as you said, the leaders of the future, right? Not just political leaders, but thought leaders, scientists, writers, people in the entertainment industry, people that have influence over other people. it's there's a lot of pressure on you guys, to be honest, to do the right thing. I mean, it's like it is. It's not. We're not. We don't have to fight the British again, but we're fighting ourselves now in some ways.
Hmm.
And I feel like there's a we've put a lot of weight on your shoulders that probably didn't necessarily need to be there, but that's just kind of how it works, you know. I mean, it's the tough times create tough men kind of situation, I guess. Because one of the things I read in your book was about and this isn't to counter your point or anything, but you said that a lot of Gen Z hires are kind of using HR as thought police once they get into positions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that seems that seems like it's not anti cancel culture, or at least very sensitive to it. You know what I mean? Or
Yeah,
how
that's
do you
that
explain
tyranny
that?
of the minority. Yeah, that tyranny of the minority with Gen Z, where I think that sometimes the most vicious cancelers are in my
Mm,
generation. I think there's a very small and very scary minority of young people who scare the shit out of the rest of us, to be completely honest, and scare us all into submission. That's 100%. I would say like Gen Z is probably has the most disproportionately small but super loud,
mm.
scary like
Well, who is it
warriors
scary
on
to
this front.
exactly? It's definitely scary to corporations because they will see like literally one tweet and pull advertising from a company. You know what I
Oh
mean?
yeah,
Like, but who
it's
I don't understand that because I have a lot of companies. I was the VP of marketing at Black Rifle Coffee for years. We did all kinds of shit that pissed people off. And we just like, they were like, oh, that wasn't nice. I'm like, yeah, go fuck yourself, dude. It wasn't for you. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like we're doing
yeah.
stuff for people that we like and that like us. You don't have to, it doesn't, you're not doing anything to show up to a party you were not invited to and telling people you don't like the party. That's nothing. You've done nothing. You know what I mean? You
Hmm.
haven't solved the world's
Yep.
problems. You're just being a cunt,
Yeah.
frankly. Like, just get the fuck out of my office. But there
Yeah.
is like in that scenario, it does. I can't. It's certainly susceptible to it. Uh, our entire uh, um, our entire culture is susceptible to this tyranny of the minority. How do you insulate from that? I mean, you just got to tell people to stop being bitches. I guess. I don't know. I don't know.
Hmm.
Frankly, what do you even do about that? Like Charles Barkley, for example, said that there are a lot of fat women in San Antonio. San Antonio is the third fattest city in the country, so that's statistically a fact, right? And then they were like, "Oh,
Hmm.
you can't say that." He goes, "Well, I mean, fuck you." That to me seems like the
Yeah.
appropriate way to handle that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, essentially that's what we advocate for. I understand the like if you're a business leader who's been there for a couple decades, building your career, minding your own business, not being political, just going up the ladder, and then all of a sudden someone shows up and threatens to tear everything down by unleashing some like scary and unfamiliar social media mob upon you. Like I get how people want to just appease these kids to get them to go away. It's totally understandable. I think it just got so nuts in 2020, and like there's so many little kind of it seems like cultural realizations that we're having, whether it's like Ibram X Kendi's anti-racist center scaling down and stuff, or we're kind of quietly being like, maybe we went a little bit nuts and overboard in appeasing these very squeaky wheels. But I would say there are two examples that we point to in the book. One is Netflix's
Hmm.
response to the Dave Chappelle controversy, where they basically updated their employee handbook and said, like, we're going to publish stuff that you don't agree with, and if you don't think that works for you, then move along. Which I think is one important thing, to just draw that line and say, like, this is we're apolitical, and we're not endorsing everything
Hmm.
that we're doing or whatever. I mean, they're different from like a typical corporation, I suppose, because they're producing content. But also another example was from Coinbase back when they were, I guess, doing a little bit better than they are now. But their CEO said that they basically like drew a line in the sand, and they said, we're not a political organization. We're not going to take a stance or write statements on any sort of contentious political issue at all whatsoever. We're just going to be down the middle. You can advocate for whatever you want to advocate for in your own time, and if that's a problem, then here's a period of time where you can like we'll give you severance if you want to leave. And I'm just really surprised to find out that 5% of their workforce did leave. But like that's not the 5% of people that you want working for you. And if people are going to be so angry that a corporation just won't take a political stance or viewpoint, then I mean that's a pretty perfect example of like there's this teeny tiny little group of squeaky wheels that want to be appeased, and 95% of people just want to fucking work, for
Yeah,
lack of
yeah, yeah,
a
yeah.
better term. So I think that's the sort of thing where, to your point, it's just like, yeah, suck it up. This is how it's going to be going forward. We're not going to continue to capitulate to this stuff. And if you don't like it, go elsewhere.
Yeah, I like it. It's like the confluence of two good maxims. One is you don't have to be faster than the bear; you have to be faster than the other guy, right? That's one of them, and you compare
Hmm.
and you combine that with this self-selection process that you can create in a you can create it in any environment, by the way, but a corporate environment, it's especially easy to create it when you're very clear about rules and expectations. You know what I mean? And it helps to have a good legal team to help you with that as well, but clear about rules and expectations and giving people the opportunity to opt out, because most of the time they will, frankly. They want to go
Hmm.
somewhere. People want to have their voices heard, whether they're right or wrong. And if they feel like their voice isn't being heard,
Yeah.
they're going to get rowdy for a while. And if you don't give them the outlet internally to get rowdy, they'll go get rowdy somewhere else and fuck up, right? They're
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good advice. So before we get out of here, are you guys doing signed copies of these books, or is I know you're on pre-order now, right?
Yeah, I honestly, I'm sure at some point we'll be doing that.
Okay.
I don't know. I just got my box of 50 of them showing up at my house. I'm not entirely sure what to do with all them. But yeah, I imagine at some point we're going to do that. We're also doing a little kind of small book tour because we're in if Greg's in DC and I'm in New York, so these are good places to stick around.
Mm.
But we'll be going to a few events across the country, and yeah, October 17th is our release date, and it's out in the world. I also did the audiobook, which was one of the weirdest experiences
Yeah,
ever.
it's
So
rough, man. It's rough. Just
it's bizarre.
yeah, you really have to enunciate. Especially if you have a good, I mean, it's good to have a good director, but it's also very annoying. Like, can you read that back? Like, motherfucker. No, I can't read it back. I've read it 8 times. Do you know,
Yeah.
is there somewhere online where the tour dates are going to be?
I will, I could post that on Twitter. That's actually probably a smart thing for me to do. So by the time this comes out, it'll be on my Twitter page. How's that for an
Yeah,
answer?
great. Yeah, that's perfect. All right, good. So go to, I mean, you can get it anywhere, Barnes and Noble, blah blah blah, but Amazon's always the easiest. The Canceling of the American Mind, by Greg Lukianoff and Rikki Schlott. It was a great read. I appreciate you sending it to me. I'm gonna need one of your books though, like a real one for my collection.
For sure.
So
You got it. Send me your address. I'll have
I
Simon and
will.
Schuster send
I
one
will.
over.
I'll email it to you today. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming today. I really
Thank you.
appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was super interesting. Thanks for
Yes,
having
ma'am.
me.
And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.